Well, first follow-up to the big red button videos. First, I was grateful for the responses. There's quite a few of them, and the honesty of them. Some people don't like this, me asking this question, like it's almost a sacrilege or a crime against nature to question nature. And I don't want to pick out individual things, but there was one person who I really do respect, and talking about plants feeling, and it really gets impossible when we can't even agree on what a consciousness is. That really messes up things a little bit. So I'm not going to go into an extensive biology lesson, but it's ludicrous to think plants feel. They have thorns on them because that's how they've evolved to protect themselves by natural selection's rules, not because of any volition on their own. Their behavior is completely, natural. It's nature's dictate. It has nothing to do with any kind of independent volition on their part, and certainly no consciousness. There's no without a central nervous system, there is no consciousness. I mean, we really should know that. If I cut my finger off, it's still alive, but it's not going to have any will. It's not going to feel anything. So anyway, don't want to get bogged down in that. The other part of it was this. There was a whole. He also pointed out the balance. That nature is balanced, and it's not balanced in any productive way. It's the balance is. It's of course. It's always going to. There's always going to be a state. It's always going to be in a state of being, and over time it would be logical that there be certain consistencies in that state, but there's nothing necessarily. The balance doesn't have any value in and of itself. I mean, you can call it balanced, that a possum living in New England would have a lifespan of 3 years and is likely to have its tail frozen off, because it really isn't suited to this environment, but it's pushing the envelope, and a lot of animals are pushing the envelope. They don't live balanced lives. Birth and death are not the only harshnesses in their existence. It's a perpetual struggle to survive, and they are scarred and beat up all through life. By, if it isn't parasites, it's carnivores, and it's not an easy life. And even among the carnivores, I mean, they fight with each other, they kill each other. There's no balance. The balance is war. If you want to call war balance, that's your prerogative, but I don't see any balance in war, and nature is war. So let's get to the questions anyway. It was curious, that most people, like 8 to 1, wouldn't live their own life. I mean, wouldn't impose it on their child. I assume, for logical reasons, that they've endured some personal experiences that were quite brutal, and they wouldn't even want to relive those experiences. And there were a few more who said, yeah, okay, 3 times the suffering? No way, no chance. And so, that sort of made sense. Then most people, 8 to 1, yeah, they really wouldn't be bothered living the average animal's life, because it just doesn't, a lizard or a vole, yeah, it's just not a great life. I mean, it's not an elaborate consciousness. It's just going to be living in fear and running and chasing, and it's not going to be doing any Shakespeare reading. It's not going to be listening to beautiful music. So anyway, but that makes the answer to the first question really interesting, because by the same kind of overwhelming majority, most people would not press the button to exterminate a dead-end life infestation on a planet. So if the infestation of life had no future in terms of its intelligence, you'd still let it live. Even though you wouldn't want to live its life, you'd still leave it alone. And that I find really curious, because that just indicates what I'm sort of fighting against, is that, you know, and like I said, I have to fight it in myself. I love nature, but I understand that I love it for the same reason I find certain women attractive, or some other reason. It's very much a conditioned impulse. It's very much a romantic notion, not an intellectual one. And that was one of my biggest battles, I'd say, intellectually, was getting to the realization that, yes, the Mother Nature is a myth, that there isn't anything, there's any reason to presume nature knows what it's doing, or that it's doing anything worthwhile. And so anyway, but like I said, it's very curious that most of you wouldn't press the button to put those animals out of their misery, so to speak. I mean, by my definition, because I would argue that the suffering, that's the real question it all comes down to, is how do we measure the good and the bad? How do we, like I said, I think I've pointed out in a video anyway that I think suffering is a given. We know that's a bad. We know that suffering in and of itself is a negative thing, and it's figuring out what the good is that compensates for that suffering is where the question gets complicated, because we can think about the satisfaction of a good meal, we can think about the satisfaction of ego victories in life, you know, those things that make you feel good, and you know, relationships are a big part of our lives, and sex, and the reward we get in that relationship, the satisfaction we get anyway. But even those relationships in and of themselves do have a cost. I mean, they do cost us emotionally. They're difficult to maintain. And it is, you know, as I said, it's so much of what we live for is an addiction. It's, you know, we want it because we want it, you know, not for any intellectual reason, but because our body aches for it, because our very being aches for it. We just need it. And we don't make a judgment about the validity of the need. All we know is that we need it and we want it. And that's what sort of corrupts the question, because we really don't know what kind of state of mind we are in. Even when we are generally comfortable, are we really comfortable? I mean, compared to some perfect bliss, is this might seem to some other sentient being that is experiencing some other feeling, they might find it horrible to have to live inside our bodies, because they might be more aware of all the little tensions.
And so maybe even in our neutral state, we really don't, maybe we just don't have a scale individually. Maybe that's a corruption that's very hard for us to get past, is that we can know absolutes in a way. We know what feeling really good is, and we know what feeling really bad is, but that stuff in the middle is sort of gray. And maybe it's irrelevant. Maybe all life is the good and the bad, you know, the spectacular and the horrible, and maybe those are the only things that need to be put on the scale. And but even when we put those on the scale, I mean, how do you do it? Because how I measure it is going to be completely different than how you measure it. I would say, you know, experiencing this, and this, you know, some event, you know, you couldn't pay me $1 million to experience it. And somebody else might say, yeah, I'll do it for $5. You know, and that's, I mean, that's the part that's hard to come up with some sort of objective perspective to make those definitions. And that's sort of what I'm pursuing. I mean, it's not, you know, it's sort of the most important question in the universe, but it's the hardest question. And so, I mean, I don't have complete answers yet, even for myself. But by my own sensibilities, I'm led in a certain direction just because of the values I impose on the question. And so that's why I left it an open, that's why I asked the questions. I'm just curious where you are, where your subjective consciousness, what it's appreciating. And it's not that dissimilar from mine, except that one question, that first question. And I just wonder if most of your reluctance is just the fact that you just don't have the confidence or the arrogance to press the button. because it just seems it's a final. It's a statement, and it's saying, it's directly kind of saying that yes, life isn't good in and of itself. That for 4 billion years, it was spinning at wheels. It wasn't getting anywhere. It wasn't doing anything. And it's only through this little tiny period that we have human consciousness, a few thousand years, human intelligence, that it does anything that means anything, really. And, you know, maybe that's just an illusion. Maybe that's just some human aggrandizement that we think we're doing something besides just spinning our wheels too. So anyway, that's the, you know, I think we'll do more, you know, I'll try to do more videos on this subject, you know, once a week or whatever. This is really kind of the ultimate question kind of thing, you know. If we can answer these questions, then we don't have to bother with the rest of the stuff.